Got it. Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist. My name is Tim, and I will be your host for the last of this 3-week Creepy Crawly series, just in time for Halloween. I had a lot of fun with today's episode, and I hope you enjoy watching it. It focuses on worms, and there are a lot of things that we call worms, so I try to stick with one of the more familiar worms to us, especially if you ever go fishing, as one of you mentioned in our pre-chat, the night crawlers. So I'll tell the narrative framed around the night crawler just to keep me on track a little bit, because worms is a really big can. So thank you again to all of the Backyard Naturalist subscribers. You all are so appreciated as we continue the series. And if you enjoy tuning in with us every Friday morning for fantastic speakers, I encourage you to consider supporting us with a subscription. I also am very appreciative of Urban Ecology Center members. Becoming a member is the best way to support our organization and our mission of connecting people in cities to nature and each other. And with so much happening virtually these days, on Tuesday, November 16th at 5 o'clock, our IT team is offering a special members-only Q&A session on all things technology. So do you want to learn about your computer's energy use, or do you have questions about technology in general? Our IT team, David and James, can answer pretty much anything you can throw at them, from how can I conserve energy when using my technology, to what's the best app for virtual gatherings, to how can I get my internet to run faster, and everything in between. Also, our friends at Collective Flow Wellness Space just opened a new studio right across the street from the Riverside Park UEC. To celebrate, they are offering a special deal on their unlimited monthly membership for UEC members. Monthly membership is typically $90 a month, but as a UEC member, you can join for $75 a month. So these are two of the many membership perks for you all. And for more information on any of these, please check your monthly members' email or contact Glenna Holstein. And Chad, the nature dad, came back after a break of teaching kids, and he's got a really short but fun episode on woolly aphids. So this will be the trailer before the full-length feature episode. And take it away, Chad.
Hey friends, Chad the Nature Dad here. Long time no see. I've been out busy leading field trips for students, and it's great to be back in person. But while out exploring the other day, I found some very interesting insects. Let's check them out. All right, friends, we've got a super interesting insect that's here. You can see them kind of waving around there. They look like little bits of cotton, and these are woolly aphids. Yeah, they're super cool. So this is their nymph stage. They are wingless, and when they come out, their little casing kind of has a cotton-like feel to it. And then they sit, and as they're feeding, they wave their abdomens back and forth. And this is trying to keep away predators, because if one comes and tries to attack them, they can only give a tiny bite to them. And so these insects here will feed on the juices of the plants, and when they do that, they create some of this sooty mold, and you can kind of see that on the ground here, all that kind of darkish black color all around. And what we see here is all that mold that's created once the woolly aphid has eaten some of the juice. And so as we pan through here, you can see how all of this ground here has got that sooty mold that's on it. Certain look up here, you can see that they have caused some damage here to these beech trees, as they're all that sooty mold growing on them. Then as adults, they will continue to feed and overwinter underneath grass and leaves and sticks. Alright friends, thanks for joining me on this Chad the Nature Dad as we explored woolly aphids. Join me next time. Who knows what we're going to find?
I remember the first time I saw woolly aphids in the wild, and it took me a while to realize that I was looking at something alive. It just looked like something that would come out of your laundry. What do you call that stuff that comes out. You know what I'm talking about. The dryer, and lint. Yes. And I just thought it was some like lint or something blowing in the breeze. And then, obviously the times that I see the most in nature is when I'm sitting still and just looking really closely. And then I just started to notice that, wait, that's not lint. Those are actually creatures. And I probably was in the same spot that Chad was, which is seminary. I'm guessing is Seminary Woods. So if you want to look for woolly aphids, go to Seminary Woods. It's a very mature plant community, and there's a lot of things you can see there that you can't see in other parts of the city. So thank you, Chad. And then finally, Sunday is Halloween, and I encourage you to revisit last year's Halloween episode, As Gourd as It Gets, where we explained the connection between pumpkins and Halloween, and pumpkins as a berry. But the word Halloween is a contraction of All Hallows Evening, sometimes shortened as All Halloween, All Hallows Eve, or All Saints Eve. And this happens before All Saints Day, but the root word here is hallow, which is a saint or a holy person. Hallow. I've heard it both ways. All Hallows Eve is usually celebrated with a feast, as it marks the beginning of the observance of All Hallow Tide, in which that's when Christians remember the dead, including the hallows or the saints. And there's debate as to whether the current mainstream celebration of Halloween and the accompanying traditions, how that started. Some believe that the roots lie in a pagan celebration called Samhain, which marks the end of harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. And then later it got a Christian influence. Others believe that the roots were Christian and then later Americanized by us upstarts across the pond. But for many today, it is purely secular, but All Hallows Eve remains a Christian religious observance with church services and the act of lighting candles on the graves of the departed. And since October 31st marks All Hallows Eve, then November 1st marks All Hallows Day or All Saints Day, also known as Hallowmas. So Hallowmas follows Hallow Evening. This is also known as the Feast of All Saints or Solemnity of All Saints, to honor all the saints of the church, whether they are known or unknown. And this was kind of needed according to the church because for about 500 years, these feasts commemorating Christian martyrs and saints were held in various places on various dates. And Pope Gregory IV said, enough with this nonsense. This is too hard to keep track of. I just want to keep one date on my messy calendar. So let's just all celebrate on one day, the same day, November 1st. And I don't know if this statement is going to pass the scrutiny of any religious scholars, because this is not my forte, but I think my go-to on this topic, Mike Larson, might approve. So then the next day, November 2nd, is known as All Souls Day, to commemorate all of the souls that have departed, regardless if they were a saint. So if you were a saint, you got 2 days of celebration. If you weren't, you still got a full day. So to kind of sum up, All Hallows Tide is a 2.5 day celebration that includes All Hallows Eve, All Hallows Day, and All Souls Day. And then the Latinx community, particularly communities in Mexico, added a twist that I really like. If you've heard of Dia de los Muertos, which is a 2-day celebration that spans All Saints Day and All Souls Day, and has a much more joyful tone, as a contrast to the more traditional solemn tone of the holidays. It's celebrated on the 1st and 2nd of November for all people, saints, martyrs, and us regular people. Family and friends gather to pay respects and to remember friends and family members who have died. It's a time to share funny and loving anecdotes of the departed, and to create ofrendas, which is a type of home altar. And it's not just the departed that they're celebrated. It's a time to celebrate the living connections we have currently as well. So kind of an all-encompassing celebration of both life and death. And I'm not a member of any of the communities associated with All Hallows Tide or Dia de los Muertos, so I hope I did an okay job and didn't offend, but I encourage you to explore and understand these celebrations further as a kind of a human-centric phenology. So, okay, on to the featured creepy crawly, the night crawler. Colloquially, we tend to use the term night crawler for just about any really big worm, especially those that we use for fishing. And you can narrow down the group into about 3 species that are actually called night crawlers around the world, And then you can narrow it down further to the species that is likely the one that you will get from the bait store if you go fishing. So Lumbricus terrestris. And to understand Lumbricus terrestris, we'll take a few quick steps back in the tree of life. So we visited many different groups in Backyard Naturalists, from protozoa to archaea, from bacteria to fungi, from trees to arthropods. But this is our first visit to a very large and very diverse group of animals called the annelids, or phylum Annelida, also known as the ringed worms or the segmented worms. Annelid has a Latin root meaning little ring, and we have identified over 22,000 living species in this group, and it includes the ragworms, it includes the earthworms, and then the best friend of anybody who likes to dip their toes in a serene northern lake, the leeches. And as one might expect, this large, diverse group can live just about anywhere where there's water or moisture. So they can be in oceans and lakes, tidal zones, hydrothermal vents, and even just the moist soil in our backyard. Annelids, just like humans, are bilaterally symmetrical. So they have a right half and a left half. They are unlike humans in that they're invertebrates, meaning they don't have vertebrae or a backbone. They move around with the help of parapodia, which translates to beyond or beside the feet. These are lateral outgrowths along each body segment. There's usually a pair per segment, and sometimes they're large enough for us to see. Sometimes you can barely see them at all. Sometimes movement is accentuated through a process called peristalsis, which is what we're used to seeing in our backyard worms. So in each segment is divided by septa, and those septa can change shape and create this undulating motion across their body, which is what helps the worm move. And that's what we're used to when you have a worm in your hand and it's kind of squirming around. There is another unique way of locomotion in this group that might also be the basis of horror films, because some of the burrowing species will actually kind of distend their pharynx from inside their mouth and kind of like vomit it out, and then use that to kind of pull itself forward through the ground. And I'm really glad that's not how we move as humans. You could imagine just kind of like, I got to get over there. Let me throw up my innards and use that to pull me over there. So yeah, before we move into the earthworm section of the annelids, I will say a few quick things about the group as a whole, and then the non-earthworm group. So this entire group has been really important in scientific research. Many of them are indicator species that indicate the health of an ecosystem, especially those that don't tolerate pollution very well. The jaws of this not at all scary ragworm are used in biomimicry studies by engineers that are looking for applications of how did this tiny animal create such an extremely strong yet lightweight pair of jaws. So it's being studied by engineers. And leeches, not sure if there's much you want me to say about them, but for a long time, they were an important component of our healthcare system, healthcare community, mainly through a process called bloodletting. In fact, many species are still endangered today because of the legacy of centuries and centuries of over-harvesting them from the wild. In the 1830s in France, they imported 40 million leeches per year. And then later, a lot of these leeches that they imported were exported to places like Britain. And, this wasn't necessarily just like a one-time prescription from your doctor. Some people used leech therapy quite regularly, the way that, might use a neti pot today, or meditation or hot yoga or something like that. So the process of bloodletting today is much rarer, but it is still used in certain circles. And then a final note on annelids before we move into the earthworms. This is a really important group, the marine polychaetes. Very important, but poorly known. Up to 1/3 of all nearshore environment species can be constituted by these marine polychaetes. Their burrowing is super important in enabling water and oxygen to penetrate the seafloor, and many ecosystem processes and species depend on this group. So unfortunately, they're starting to ingest a lot of plastic in the oceans and turning them into microplastics, and that's harmful for themselves, and it's harmful for many other parts of the nearshore marine community. So just another reason why it's so important for us all to continue in this journey of a reduced plastic lifestyle, but maybe one of the most important groups of creatures you've never heard of, or maybe some of you have heard of them. Our night crawler belongs to the class Clitellata, and you might think that's a boring fact, but you'd be wrong, because think about it. If you're to draw freehand without a reference a night crawler, I'd be willing to bet that many of us would draw that little band that you see near the head. It's just slightly thicker than the rest of the body, and that is called a clitellum. So this group of earthworms all have that clitellum. So this is a non-segmented section that plays many roles, including producing slime, and they also from that slime they can make this viscid sac that we call a cocoon. So worms have cocoons too, and the cocoon is used to store the eggs, a fertilized egg. And something that I wasn't aware of, in earthworms, the clitellum can only be seen when the worm is sexually mature. And then when it's reproducing, it becomes orange. So leeches, incidentally, also have a clitellum, and they're still in this group, but the clitellum is only present during the mating season, whereas in the worms, it's always present once they become mature. So we move on to the next grouping, the order Opisthophora, and you might think, hey, that's a boring fact. This time you'd be right, so don't worry about it. We'll move on. And then eventually we separate out the leeches and we reach the Lumbricidae. And this is what we call the earthworms. And there's 670, more than 670 species of earthworms that we've named. They're an extremely successful species. And a lot of them, 33 of them, have become naturalized in areas that aren't part of their natural range, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, North America, Eurasia, Japan, some down in Australia. And all of these were moved around the world by humans, by us. So the case that's most familiar to us, when European settlers came to North America, so did the European earthworms. And when I say European settlers brought earthworms to this part of the country, they brought all of the earthworms to this part of the country. Any area that's north of this line that you see here has no natural earthworms since the last ice age. So the line is the recent glaciation, and you can see that little area in southwest Wisconsin we call the driftless area. But if you're anywhere above this line, the glaciation killed off all of the worms, and so all of the anywhere above that line, if you dig in the yard and you see worms, those are non-native worms, and many of them are also invasive. So this can be confusing because they're when we think of worms, you often hear about how good they are for the soil. They provide aeration, they're good for your garden, they're good for agriculture. This may be true, but a lot of recent studies are actually suggesting that worms don't help your garden. And in fact, in some cases, they can probably harm them by accelerating water and nutrient loss. But you're probably not going to notice it as much in your backyard garden. It's probably more accurate to say that the worms are attracted to the good soil that you have rather than that they're helping it. Unless you have severely impacted soil, then worms can be helpful. But for the most part, if it's an environment that's not a compost bin, that's not a vermicompost, worms probably do more harm than good. So then the big question is why? Why are worms so harmful to our natural areas? And there are several reasons, but it mainly has to do with the fact that, for a long time, our hardwood forests developed and evolved in the absence of worms. So all the systems that are in place in this ecosystem developed in the absence of worms. And so when you don't have worms here in the northern forests, the leaves that fall from the trees take a much longer time to decompose, way more slowly. And so what you get is a really healthy layer called the duff layer on the ground. And here's a cross section of that layer. A thick, healthy duff layer offers an excellent growing environment that protects our native woodland wildflowers, our spring beauties, our trillium. It also protects tiny tree seedlings in that vulnerable stage. It protects the more delicate plants like ferns. It protects the roots of smaller trees. And it's an important habitat for a lot of our small ground dwelling animals like salamanders and all the wonderful beetles we heard about last week. So a thick duff layer offers, it's like a protective nursery for both animals and plants. And it's also really important in reducing or preventing soil erosion. When a heavy rain, all that water is going to kind of stay in place. And it's an important sink for atmospheric carbon, which we're trying to reduce to mitigate global warming. So a thick duff layer in northern forests equals a healthy forest, and there's a lot of good things. When earthworms establish themselves in an area, they start to eat those fallen leaves, and worms multiply very quickly, and you get a lot of worms that are all eating. And then you start to, that duff layer starts to thin out, and in a lot of cases, you will lose it completely. Seasonally, you'll get some more leaves falling, but then they'll be gone right away. So if you walk through a forest and you see very few leaves on the ground, and you see large patches of bare soil, and you see lots of worm castings, you're looking at an unhealthy forest floor. This likely isn't a big deal for the big trees and shrubs, but without a duff layer, those young seedlings, the roots, and the ferns and wildflowers and things I mentioned earlier, they're much more exposed. And this can result in a much lower survival rate. And no duff layer also means much greater potential for soil erosion, and important nutrients that are normally tightly cycled will begin to leach away from the increased erosion, and the underground worm tunnels will help leach away more of those nutrients. And according to the Minnesota State DNR, the productivity of both forests and fish habitats are severely reduced when worms become established. And if that's not enough, as hungry worms eat all those leaves, they're returning that atmospheric carbon back to the air, which is bad for global warming, which is bad for all of us. So adding worms into our native forests has been a huge blow for both individual species, forest ecological processes, and the planet. So like, what the heck, worms? Actually, what the heck, us? Nice job, us. We did this. So it's not all doom and gloom. I'm painting a pretty heavy picture here. And we'll look at some other sides of the coin. And I will say that worms are extremely well adapted to succeed, and that alone is worth marveling at. So I'll introduce you to a few earthworms, starting with the red worm, which is native to Europe and Western Asia, but you can pick these up at your local bait shops. And it is important for me to point out that in their native habitats in the old world, these worms do serve a very important ecological role in nutrient transfer and in trophic levels, the things they eat, the things that eat them. And those forests grew and evolved in the presence of these worms. So those same species of worms that are really destroying our forests are actually really important back in their native forests. And here is the giant earthworm. This is one that didn't make its way over here. It's native to a very restricted range in Germany with the very appropriate name, Lumbricus badensis, which I should just leave at that, but because it kind of sounds like a worm biker name or something like that, or a worm derby name. But the bad actually comes from Baden, Germany, where it's known as the giant rainworm of Baden. And this worm can grow to be 2 feet or longer. And it's really important prey for some of the bigger animals like foxes and owls. And they're very proud of this worm in that section, and they have whole trails dedicated to them and everything. So if we move on to our featured critter, which is Lumbricus terrestris, known in Europe as the common earthworm, and it's known in our parts as the nightcrawler. So this is a very favored bait for fishing. They can grow to be almost a foot in length. And there was a recent record just a few years ago of one that was 2 feet in length, a 2 foot long nightcrawler, which maybe puts that Baden worm to shame. Our neighbors to the north in Canada call this the dew worm, or sometimes the granddaddy earthworm. Parts of Europe call it the lobworm or the rainworm, but whatever you call it, we recognize it mostly as the nightcrawler. And in this particular species, you can tell the head is on the top because it is more cylindrical. It's closer to that clitellum, and then a darker brown. And then towards the back end, it kind of flattens out. Next time you pick up a worm, look at that, because to me, worms just seem cylindrical throughout. They're actually flatter on one end and rounder on the other. They can move at the breakneck speed of 65 feet per hour. So they can move. We often see them moving like this, and especially when it's raining outside. That's when I'm sure a lot of you have seen, especially on pavement and the sidewalks, you'll see worms come out during and after rain. And scientists aren't completely sure why they do this. There are three kind of main theories. One is that they want to avoid drowning in their burrows. But there's not a lot of support for that, because worms, including nightcrawlers, can spend weeks in water as long as it's oxygenated. So you'd get in trouble if you're a type of worm that goes through oxygen quickly, and then maybe in your burrow, you go through the oxygen in your burrow too quickly, and then you may have to surface to prevent drowning. But most of these worms can spend a lot of time in the water. So that may be part of it, but the other two theories are combined into the mating and movement theory. And some biologists have proposed that worms surface to reproduce, and or probably both, one or the other, take the opportunity to make long distance treks. So sometimes you have to make a long distance trek to reproduce. Both moving and reproducing are much easier above ground or at the surface than down in the soil. So then the rain allows them to stay above ground for a longer period without the risk of drying out. So that's likely the reason that in the rain, why you see all these worms coming out for a party. They have somewhere to go or someone to be with. And this is, of course, is a prime time for predators to get them as well. And they do run the risk of drying out before they can return. And so sometimes I've seen this, you have a rain and then the worms come out and then it dries up very quickly. And then a few worms don't make it back, and you see them kind of desiccated on the sidewalk or the bike trail. The unfortunate ones that didn't make it back. One cool trick I learned in England with my parents is that our friends that wanted worms for fishing would stick one of those garden forks in the ground and just kind of like vibrate them back and forth. And they told us it was because they were making the worms think that it was raining. So the vibrations in the shovel would cause the worms to come up because they thought it was raining. In fact, I think there's even competitions to see how fast people can get worms up out of the ground. But whether or not the worms actually think it's raining or whatever reason, the vibrations do work pretty well. And the worms come up and you can collect them for your fishing trip. When they're in their burrows, they use those segments to dig in pretty well. And so it's a lot harder to get them unless they're completely out of their burrow. You've probably seen robins, tugging at an earthworm, and that earthworm inside its burrow is pretty solidly tugging back. So they use those segments to really grip in the burrow, but outside they can't do that. Here is one in the burrow, and this one, they as a group are very deep burrowers. They come to the surface to feed, unlike many worms that kind of burrow through that top layer and eat as they go. So the night crawlers will actually come to the surface and grab some of that leaf litter and pull it down into the soil. And then they'll also leave these little presents on the surface of the soil, which was one of my favorite things to explore, which is worm poop, or because Tori's here, worm dookie or worm casts. And this is the one, maybe the only kind of animal poop that is fun to touch and rub in your hands and smell. You could probably even taste it especially when you're out exploring with kids. And worm castings are also used quite a bit by us humans as fertilizer. There's a really good mix of that organic matter from the surface, those leaves, and then the mineral nutrients that the worms mix in from that mineral layer deep in their burrows that makes them really excellent fertilizers. Now, through a twist of fate, these worms, which are invasive throughout much of the world, are actually threatened and endangered in parts of their native land in northwestern Europe, most recently because of some invasive flatworms that have made their way up from Australia and New Zealand. And these are earthworm predators. They're very, very efficient earthworm predators. And remember, in these European forests, these night crawlers are really important for the ecosystem. And so as the worms are declining in their native habitats, the local species and the ecological processes begin to break down. And on to some more important worm questions, like what do they eat? Well, we already know that they mainly eat dead leaves from the soil floor, or from the forest floor and the top layer of soil. But a leaf isn't just a leaf to a nightcrawler. They prefer leaves with high concentrations of calcium and nitrogen. So their favorite leaves come from trees like basswood and ash and aspen, followed closely by maples, especially sugar maples. Oaks are less preferred because they have very little calcium, but if it's what's for dinner, it's what they'll eat. They have been observed feeding on dead insects and some living microorganisms in the soil, and even on some animal waste, but this is much less common and likely more of a diet supplement. So how do worms make more worms? So each individual worm is hermaphroditic, meaning it produces both sperm and eggs. But unlike some worms, night crawlers do require another worm to fertilize their eggs. So some worms can reproduce asexually, but night crawlers require sexual reproduction. So they essentially are in the two spots where you see the white, they are exchanging sperm to fertilize the other's eggs. So as I mentioned, copulation occurs at the surface here, and the two individuals are, at least one of them is kind of anchored in the burrow. So one of them is more at trouble from getting predated on than the other. And I don't know how they determine that, but there actually is worm courtship, and mating is preceded by repeated mutual burrow visits between neighbors, going down and coming back up. So what's actually happening here is a bit complicated and a bit hard for me to wrap my mind around, but essentially that the clitellum, the orange spot, is producing these protective cocoons that they made from the slime, as well as sperm. And then the other worm is receiving both of these and depositing the eggs. So that's in the spot that's not the clitellum. And then the fertilization actually occurs within that protective cocoon. And then it's deposited into a nearby soil chamber for protection. And again, they're both fertilizing each other at the same time. So this is what the cocoons look like on a nightcrawler anyway. And again, these are supporting the growing embryo. And you can apparently find these if you look closely enough. I never have, but now I kind of want to start looking for them. And night crawlers reproduce quite frequently, once a week, maybe once a week and a half, every week and a half. But again, it's also a dangerous time for them too. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of night crawlers. And then the question becomes, what can we do about this massive invasion of earthworms around the world? And I think it's safe to say we're not likely to get rid of them in the areas that they've invaded, since they're so well established. And you could use pesticides, but that just seems like a really bad idea since they're so well established, and pesticides kill so many other things. So the next step really comes down to slowing the spread. Earthworms are sold all over the world. Even if a few decades back, Canada was exporting 370 million worms with a value of 54 million. And that's increased. And vermiculture is an important practice of using worms to produce high quality compost. And they often use the red wiggler worm which is a different kind of worm. And worms provide an excellent source of protein for fish, fowl, pigs, and they were traditionally and sometimes still are a source of proteins for humans. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but gnocchi is considered a delicacy for chefs in New Zealand, and that was passed on from a Maori tradition. It is said that the sweet flavor in gnocchi remains in your mouth for 2 days. And I guess that's a good thing. Maybe they could turn it into toothpaste or something. But worms and insects and invertebrates in general are really becoming rediscovered as very, very important sources of protein. And we just have to read How to Eat Fried Worms. I think John Bales was telling me of a story when his daughter Sarah decided to eat some fried worms after reading the book. And one thing that she learned from it is that you should let the worms kind of sit for a while first and kind of pass the castings out before you fry them, because when they first fried them up, they were kind of eating the crunchy dirt that was within them. So we can all learn from Sarah's mistake. So knowledge is power, and just like we shouldn't move firewood around, we should also limit the movement of soil and limit the movement of worms. And the biggest way that we move worms is from fishing and from vermicomposting. So if you do practice vermicomposting, it seems like a lot to do, but if you can try to freeze the soil before you use it as compost or let it sit through a winter, do what you can, because a lot of those red wiggler worms won't survive our winter like the other worms do. If you're fishing, just be careful and don't dump your unused worms. Without humans moving them around, earthworms by themselves are very slow to progress. And it's one of the reasons why we know they didn't come here on their own after the glaciers. It can take them 100 years to move a half a mile, and that's a lot. That's fast. So we still can keep a lot of these areas earthworm free for a long time. And even in areas that already do have earthworms, it's best not to risk introducing new species to the area. So there are some really great resources online, particularly from Minnesota. Minnesota seems to be leading the way. Their DNR has an excellent campaign. There's Great Lakes Worm Watch, which has excellent resources and has methods for you to survey your worms in your backyard or anywhere using mustard seed. It's a really fun activity to do. You kind of just pour it into the soil. It irritates the skin of the worms, and then they rise to the surface, and then you can do a count if you don't want to try the garden shovel trick. So it was hard to narrow down the worm stories. It was even harder to narrow down all the great videos. Otherwise, this would have been all videos. So I'm going to stick with this one from the Minnesota DNR, mainly because I love the guy's accent, the Midwestern accent, very, very wholesome, but also because it's just a good summary of some of the conservation issues facing worms, and it introduces a new species of worms that are in a different genus that I haven't talked about yet.
I never imagined an invasive species as horrific as these jumping worms. When I saw the first forest that was infested, and as you walk across the slope, just from a person walking, the soil slides down the slope, so plants can't get rooted in it. And if the plants are destroyed, the whole plant pollinator network goes down, and that's the base of the whole ecosystem. Jumping worms are from Asia. They're in the genus Amynthus. The jumping worms are fairly distinctive, especially by mid to late summer. There's a band around a mature worm called the Clitellum, and in a jumping worm that goes all the way around, and it tends to be lighter colored in the jumping worms, and they're quite aggressive compared to the European worms. They spread faster, they thrash around when you touch them. They live only in the top couple inches of soil, unlike the European earthworms that will go down anywhere from 1.5 feet to 5 or 6 feet in the case of the nightcrawler. So they live on the very surface. The concern about jumping worms is that they cause soil erosion. They essentially turn the top 2 inches of the soil into small granules or pellets that look like cat litter or coffee grounds. So it's just loose on the surface of the soil, and when you get a heavy rain, it can erode away. And degradation of our forested ecosystems, and probably loss of native biodiversity, like our native plants. We have over 400 native plant species in these maple, basswood, and oak forests in southern Minnesota that could become endangered. And once the plants change, then you change the vegetation, that changes the habitat for wildlife. So birds, deer, squirrels, everything that lives in the ecosystem, butterflies, pollinators, could all be very negatively impacted by this invasion. So this is a real threat to native biodiversity in Minnesota. We need to limit it as much as possible. So buy earthworm-free mulch. If you have earthworms in your mulch, don't spread that around. Don't buy anything on the internet for making your own compost or for fishing bait that has jumping worms in it, or don't buy anything anywhere that has jumping worms. If you're hiking around in a forest, make sure you clean your hiking boots afterwards, because the eggs could stick to your boots. And if you find these worms, make sure you report them. There's a thing called EDDMAPS, EDDMAPS, where you can go in and make a report. And so we do encourage people to do that, so that we'll have a very thorough series of reports from throughout the state that will characterize their geographic distribution. They are an incredible threat to native biodiversity in Minnesota.
I know I often have these, wonderful David Attenborough, beautifully produced videos, but I really enjoyed this one. So we'll wrap up today.
I never imagined.
With the words of Charles Darwin, who spent 39 years studying what he called the humblest of creatures, the earthworm, and he even published a book called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, with observations on their habits, which is still in print today. And Darwin said, it may be doubted whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as have these lowly organized creatures. So that's the nightcrawler. I'm not sure how to feel about them. They're amazing, they're successful, and we gave them an opportunity to spread around the world. They're harmful and helpful, and they're extraordinary components of our backyard. So I hope you spend the weekend celebrating the lives of the humans and non-humans that are still with us and have departed in this Hallow celebration. And thank you for joining me. And I will